Across Stephen King's bestiary, there exists a category of entities that goes far beyond the traditional villain, the archetypal monster, or even the figure of the classic demon. That is why today we will be covering beings that do not belong to the human world, nor even to a recognizable universe. King calls them outsiders. Not simply because they do not belong to our world, but because they come from outside everything, including our universe. Because they originate in that space of perpetual darkness that exists between worlds. A place that in the mythology of the Dark Tower is known as the Todash space. The word outsider appears explicitly for the first time in the story, The Library Policeman. But the concept had been present long before. In it, during the ritual of Chud, it is said that the creature came from outside, not from another planet or another dimension, but from something older and alien to creation itself. Later, in If It Bleeds, King fully closes the idea by describing outsiders as beings that are different yet similar to one another, comparable to related species, like a house cat and a wildcat. This is important because Pennywise is not a unique case, but one of many. In this way, outsiders do not function as villains with understandable human motivations. They do not seek power, territorial domination, or revenge. Their behavior simply responds to impulses that are far more primal and, at the same time, much harder to comprehend. Most of these beings feed on human emotions, and they do not do so metaphorically. Fear, pain, sadness, anger, or even joy are, for them, a real source of sustenance. That is why some are often described as psychic vampires. Before continuing, it's worth pausing for a moment to talk about a game that reinforces a concept that appears repeatedly in Stephen King's cosmology. And that power is never free, and it always exists within a system that defines its reach. What often gets overlooked is that this game isn't just about collecting characters. It's about understanding roles, synergy, and how individual kits interact across different modes. Between PvE content, arena formats, and clan-based activities, the game offers a structure that encourages methodical decision-making rather than constant micromanagement. One of the reasons this is a good moment to start playing is that Ultimate Death Knight is currently available again, and for new players, he can be obtained for free. Ultimate Death Knight functions as a tank and support. His passive redirects single-target damage and debuffs to himself, allowing the rest of the team to operate with significantly reduced pressure. He also sustains himself by healing whenever enemy champions receive healing, which increases his survivability without requiring dedicated support. In addition, he provides team-wide shields and continuous healing, applies crowd control, and offers a permanent defense boost in all battles. This makes him viable across both PvE and PvP, including early progression and late-game content. For new players, this level of utility in a single legendary champion dramatically lowers the entry barrier. By downloading Raid through my link or QR code and using the promo code UDKING, new players can unlock Ultimate Death Knight at no cost. This bonus is only available when the game is installed through that specific link. In addition to that, new accounts receive an instant starter pack with Epic Drake from the Lizardmen faction, plus another epic champion, which is Knight Errant, upon reaching level 15. Together, these rewards give new players 2 epic champions right from the start, which significantly stabilizes early progression and reduces the need to rely on random summons. Additionally, Raid is giving the option to redeem one of 6 promo codes for a free legendary champion. But remember, only 1 code can be redeemed, and these rewards become available 48 hours after downloading via my link or QR code. Downloading directly from the App Store will not grant access to these bonuses. So don't miss your chance. Scan my QR code or click the link in the description. Thanks Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. See you in the game. Some of the most well-known examples are Pennywise from the novel It from 1986, the 1990 miniseries, the films released in 2017 and 2019, and the HBO series Welcome to Derry from 2025. As the most famous of all, he has the greatest number of adaptations, and most of us already know that he feeds on fear. On the other hand, there is Tak, an outsider introduced in the novel Desperation from 1996 by Stephen King and revisited in its mirror work The Regulators, also from 1996, but published under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. Tak is an extra-dimensional entity originally trapped in an abandoned mine in Nevada, from where it possesses animals and humans in order to manifest in our world. It feeds on physical pain and desperation, and its influence corrupts the surrounding reality. Desperation received a made-for-television film adaptation in 2006, produced by ABC, where Tak is portrayed in a more literal, though simplified way compared to the novel. Another example is Ardelia Lortz, who appears in the story The Library Policeman, included in the collection 4 Past Midnight from 1990. She is an outsider who adopts the appearance of an elderly woman and later the figure of a detective in order to harass and psychologically devour her victims, feeding on terror and guilt. In this story, Stephen King explicitly introduces the term outsider for the first time to describe this type of entity. Unfortunately, it has no audiovisual adaptation. There is also Rose Madder, who is the central entity of the homonymous novel Rose Madder from 1995. She is an outsider bound to a painting that functions as her anchor, which I will explain later, and from which she can manifest with an arachnid form and exert direct influence over reality. She feeds on violence, pain, and desperation, acting as a vengeful force. The novel has not yet been adapted for film or television. Dandolo is another of the most well-known. He appears in The Dark Tower 7 from 2004. He is an outsider who adopts the appearance of a comedian named Joe Collins and feeds on laughter, euphoria, and extreme joy, until those emotions turn into suffering. His true physical form is insectoid, similar to the form It adopted at the end of the 2019 film. Unfortunately, he also has no audiovisual adaptation, and his story remains exclusively within the canon of The Dark Tower for now. The Little Green God of Agony is an entity that appears in the homonymous story included in the collection The Bazaar of Bad Dreams from 2015. It is an outsider with the form of a green slug that feeds on prolonged pain and physical agony. It possesses human bodies to extend their suffering and remain active. This one has a comic adaptation published in 2011. The outsider is another of these entities, and it also shares the same name as its species. It appears in the homonymous novel from 2018 and is an entity capable of completely duplicating people, including their DNA, and feeding on grief, sadness, and the emotional suffering of the victims' families. The novel was adapted into an HBO series in 2020, preserving much of its mythological background. There is also the entity from later. This outsider appears in the novel of the same name, published in 2021. It is an entity that binds itself to a human spirit and continues acting even after death, feeding on fear and desperation. It presents direct connections to the Todash space and to concepts from the Dark Tower. It does not have an audiovisual adaptation to date. Chet Ondowski, also known by the alias Shimi that he adopts in If It Bleeds, is another example of an outsider within the Stephen King universe. This entity appears in the homonymous story included in the 2020 collection If It Bleeds, and is a direct part of Holly Gibney's narrative arc. Unlike other outsiders that operate in a more isolated manner, this being infiltrates society by adopting a false human identity, using mass media as a tool to amplify its influence. Its nourishment does not come from a single victim, but from the emotions generated by large-scale collective tragedies. Social fear, anxiety, constant worry, and the emotional impact produced by violent news and disasters. In this way, the outsider turns mediated horror into a continuous source of sustenance, feeding on the anguish shared by thousands of people at the same time. This characteristic sets it apart from other members of its species and makes it a more diffuse, less visible, but potentially more persistent threat. To date, this outsider does not have an independent audiovisual adaptation, and its story remains exclusively within the literary canon. These are the most well-known outsiders, although more exist. But there is one thing most of them share, an essential characteristic of their nature, which is that they do not usually move freely through the world, since most of them are bound to a place, an object, or a host. For example, Derry is Pennywise's, the Desperation Mine is Tak's, or the cave is the outsider's anchor. Because of this, when they manifest outside these spaces, they do so in a limited, incomplete way, or through possession. And here, another trait these beings share appears, which is form. Not the original one, but the ability to change it, because outsiders in most cases are shapeshifters, and even though their true forms have similarities among them. Some are spiders, others are insectoid beings, and even larvae or slugs. But all of these are still interpretations generated by the human brain when they are perceived. This is because behind them exists something deeper, something the human mind cannot process without breaking. In it, those extreme manifestations appear as the deadlights or floating lights of orange color, which, when seen, cause madness, catatonia, or outright death. In top, they are red lights, and the strangest are those of the outsider, which are described as black in color or like a kind of living darkness. With this in mind, it becomes clear that Pennywise is not the Stephen King monster, but one of many other horrors that inhabit the darkness outside space and time. And to truly understand them, one must first understand the outsiders as a species, as a concept, and as a cosmic threat. To do this, we must first break the common idea that they are extraterrestrials in the classic sense. No, they are neither aliens nor demons, nor simple supernatural monsters. Outsiders are extra-dimensional entities, creatures that exist outside the human universe, in a liminal region known in different ways throughout King's work as Todash space, the Macroverse, or the darkness between worlds. They are beings that perceive the dimensions of space and time differently, something Pennywise hints at in the final episode of the first season of Welcome to Derry. Stephen King also makes this clear when he describes the mental confrontation between Bill Denbrough and it in the novel, when human consciousness briefly accesses the Macroverse. In addition, all outsiders share an essential condition. They cannot exist fully in our world. Their true form belongs to the Macroverse. What we see of them on Earth is not their real form, but imperfect physical manifestations or avatars anchored to our plane through cracks in reality. These cracks, known in the mythology of the Dark Tower as thinnies, appear in places where the fabric of the world has been weakened by death, pain, violence, or catastrophic events. That is why outsiders are always tied to specific spaces, specific objects, or even people. Generally, they do not choose these scenarios. Rather, they were points where reality has been eroded and allows them to partially project themselves. However, in the case of it, the functioning is slightly different. Its anchor is not the town of Derry itself, but the exact point where it fell millions of years ago and where its physical form remains buried underground. Derry was built around that place, eventually becoming its hunting ground, where its influence is complete and the town became a community psychically contaminated by its presence. Although the entity loses strength the farther it moves away, basically, it loses signal. Despite this, it can exert limited influence beyond Derry, but it cannot fully manifest or sustain its feeding cycle outside of it. Additionally, although the book mentions the house on Niebald Street as a thinny, it functions only as an access point that facilitates its manifestations, but does not serve as its anchor. And to add to this, the new series Welcome to Derry, which is canon only to the film's storyline, introduces pillars made from fragments of the meteorite to keep it confined to Derry. But this concept belongs exclusively to that canon and not to the original novel. But as I mentioned before, in other cases, an outsider's anchor can be a mine, a house, a cave, or even a human body. And as long as that anchor exists, the physical manifestation can continue to operate. When it is destroyed or sealed, the connection breaks and the entity is forced to retreat back into the Todash. That is why even though outsiders may appear omnipotent, they are always limited by whatever binds them to our world and can never fully detach from their anchor. Another fundamental characteristic is that they do not feed on flesh as their primary objective, even though they may consume bodies. Their true nourishment is extreme human emotion, since emotions are their vital energy. And each outsider has different preferences. Pennywise feeds on fear, specifically childhood fear transformed into terror. Tok feeds on pain and physical suffering. The little green god of agony consumes prolonged pain. Dandelo feeds on laughter and euphoria. The outsider from the novel of the same name feeds on grief, sadness, and loss. This explains why many outsiders deliberately provoke extreme situations before finishing off their victims. In simple terms, they need to season the victim before consuming them. That is why fear, guilt, desperation, or sadness are not side effects, but rather the main course for them. There is also an interesting pattern in their physiology. Although they can adopt multiple forms, when indications of their original physical form are described, meaning the form humans are capable of perceiving, it is usually insectoid or arachnid. As we already know, Pennywise is a spider. Rose Madder is also an arachnid being. Ardelia Lords has insect-like traits. Dandelo resembles a beetle, and the outsider is composed of larvae. Another point the outsiders have in common is that confronting them is not just a matter of strength. It requires willpower, faith, imagination, and above all, mental resistance. And this is where Pennywise begins to differentiate himself from the rest. Because even though he belongs to this species, his relationship with humans and with fear is far more intimate, far more prolonged, and far more perverse. It seems then that although Pennywise technically belongs to this same family of entities, he is not a common outsider. He occupies a singular position within this typology, not only because of his power, but because of his antiquity, his connection to the Macroverse, and his narrative role within the central mythology of King's work. The first major difference is territorial scope. While most of his counterparts are bound to something very specific, Pennywise, by contrast, is tied to Derry as a complete system, not to a single physical point. The sewers, the house on Neibold Street, and the well are not his prison, but extensions of his territory. In addition, it does not need a permanent host or an object to contain him. The entirety of Derry serves that function. The second difference is the type of feeding. All outsiders feed on emotions, but Pennywise does so in a more complex and refined way. He does not merely consume fear, he cultivates it. He manipulates entire generations, normalizes violence, distorts the town's moral compass, and creates an emotional ecosystem that guarantees him a constant food supply for decades. Other outsiders, by contrast, function as opportunistic predators, feeding when they encounter pain, grief, or immediate suffering. Pennywise, however, acts more like a rancher. He plans, cultivates fear, and conditions an entire community in order to maximize the quality of his sustenance. There are also important differences in their cycles of activity. Pennywise follows a pattern of approximately 27 years, not necessarily due to a strict biological hibernation, but as an efficient strategy that allows him to feed and then withdraw while the community recovers enough to generate fear once again. Other outsiders, on the other hand, enter dormancy when their food source runs out or when their anchor weakens. In those cases, rest is not a strategic choice, but a necessity imposed by the limitations of their physical manifestation in our world. However, this complexity also carries a crucial weakness. Pennywise, by spending so much time trying to understand humans, ends up underestimating them. He mocks them. He sees them as inferior prey. And that arrogance, common among many outsiders, is what ultimately allows him to be wounded and defeated. His dependence on childhood imagination, his need to play with his victims, and his excessive confidence in his own immortality make him vulnerable in a way that simpler outsiders are not. Finally, there is the most important difference: hierarchy. Pennywise is not the ultimate embodiment of evil in Stephen King's universe, but neither is he a simple predator. He is an intermediary between greater forces, an executor of chaos on a local scale, indirectly subordinate to entities such as the Crimson King, yet autonomous enough to operate on his own for millions of years. In short, Pennywise is an outsider, but not just any outsider. He is the most developed, the oldest, and the most dangerous version of his species. And understanding this is key to grasping why defeating him was possible, but also why it was not an absolute victory. When compared to higher entities such as the Guardians of the Beams, Maturin, or Gon, Pennywise occupies a lower tier. He is dangerous, lethal, and devastating on a local scale, but he does not control the structure of the multiverse, nor can he destroy the Dark Tower. He is a cosmic predator, yes, but not a creative force or a regulator of balance. Understanding this is essential in order neither to overestimate nor underestimate Pennywise. It is not the supreme villain of Stephen King's universe, but it is one of the most narratively effective. And that is precisely why, even though many outsiders exist, none has left a mark as deep as Pennywise. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you like this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out. And remember, if you're interested, don't forget to download Raid Shadow Legends using my link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen to unlock exclusive new player bonuses, including epic champions and a free legendary.